The air in South Kingstown was thick with the scent of salt hay and damp earth as the sun began to dip behind the tree line. In the distance, the Atlantic sent a rhythmic hum over the hills, but for Samuel Teft, the only sound that mattered was the silence coming from inside his small timber-framed home. Outside in the pasture, the cattle shifted restlessly, their heavy breath visible in the cooling air. Samuel paced the length of the stone wall, his hands stained from a day's labor but his mind miles away. Beside him, his nephew Peter leaned against a wooden post, whittling a piece of cedar just to keep his fingers busy. "The waiting is the hardest part, Sam," Peter said softly, not looking up. "The land takes its time, and so does a firstborn." Samuel nodded, though he couldn't find his voice. Inside that house was Elizabeth, his heart, his strength, and she was in the middle of a battle he couldn't fight for her. He caught a glimpse of movement through the window. He saw his mother, Mary, moving with purpose, her silhouette steady and sure. Beside her, his sisters moved like shadows, carrying basins of warm water and linens. Mary Teft was the anchor of the family. She had brought her own children into this rugged Rhode Island wilderness, and now she was bringing the next generation. The minutes stretched like hours. Then, a sharp, thin cry pierced the evening air. Samuel froze. Peter dropped his carving. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then came a second cry, stronger, more demanding, and Samuel didn't wait. They broke into a run, boots thudding against the packed dirt, their hearts racing faster than their feet. When Samuel burst through the door, the heat of the hearth and the scent of lavender hit him. The room was bathed in the golden glow of tallow candles. There, in the center of the bed, sat Elizabeth. She was exhausted, her hair clinging to her damp forehead, but she was wearing a smile that Samuel thought could light the entire colony. Mary stepped forward, her face lined with the wisdom of a grandmother's new beginning. In her arms was a bundle of white linen. "A boy, Samuel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Samuel's hands trembled as he reached out. When he took his son, the weight was so light, yet it felt like he was holding the entire future of the Teft name. Looking down at the tiny, wrinkled face and the miniature hands, the stoic farmer's exterior finally gave way. Warm, proud tears tracked through the dust on his cheeks. He leaned down, his beard brushing the baby's soft temple, and whispered a name that felt like a promise to the Rhode Island soil. "Welcome, John." With a chest full of wonder, he turned and placed the baby back into the waiting arms of Elizabeth. Mary stood by them, tears of joy reflecting in her eyes as she watched her son become a father. In that small room, surrounded by the women who had nurtured him and the fallen brother who stood by him their entire childhood, Samuel knew the Teft legacy had truly begun. In the quiet hum of South Kingstown, John grew like a strong oak rooted in the rocky soil of his family's land. He was more than just a name to his grandmother Mary. He was a living echo of the grandfather he had never met, whose likeness he now carried in the tiny broadness of his little shoulders and the steady gaze of his gray eyes. Mary watched him as he tended to the sheep, his tiny hands sure and confident as they moved over the thick wool. It was the same deft touch his father and his grandfather had used, a language spoken without words. In the evenings, John would sit by Mary's feet, listening to stories of the early days in the wilderness, of battles won and hardships endured. To him, these were not just tales. They were the foundation of his existence. At 2 years old, little John was a whirlwind of energy. He had his father's sturdy frame and his grandmother Mary's inquisitive eyes. He spent his days helping Samuel in the barn, his tiny hands clutching a stray piece of straw as if it were a prized tool, or toddling after the hens with a delighted shriek. But lately, John had noticed a change. His mother, Elizabeth, didn't scoop him up for a hip ride as often as she used to. Instead, she would sit by the window, her hands resting over the gentle, rising curve of her apron. One evening, as the smell of roasting venison filled the room, John waddled over to her. He pressed his sticky face against her knee, pointing at her belly with a confused "Mama." Elizabeth smiled, her face glowing in the amber firelight. She took his small hand and placed it firmly against the fabric of her dress. For a moment there was a stillness, then a sharp, tiny thump from within. John's eyes went wide. He pulled his hand back, looked at his palm, and then looked at Elizabeth. "A brother or a sister, John?" she whispered, smoothing his hair. "A new friend for these woods." As the family prepares for another beautiful arrival, Mary Teft, the woman who had once outpaced the sun and outworked the men of the family, now found her world shrinking. The heavy iron kettles she once swung with ease now felt like anchors, and the long walk to the herb garden, where the sage and hyssop grew thick, seemed as vast as the trek to the Narragansett coast. One afternoon, the golden light of a Rhode Island autumn spilled across Mary's quilt. She lay propped against her pillows, her breath rhythmic and shallow. Her hands, once calloused and stained by the dark earth she loved, were now pale and still, resting like fallen leaves upon the wool. The door creaked, and Elizabeth entered. Her own journey was heavy now. Her belly was a high, proud curve that moved with the restless energy of the new life inside. She carried a wooden bowl of broth, the steam carrying the scent of the very garden Mary could no longer reach. "The lavender is blooming late this year, Mother," Elizabeth said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed with a careful sigh. "I brought a sprig for your pillow." Through the open window, Mary watched her daughters. They were silhouettes in the twilight, moving through the rows of the mother garden. They were pulling the last of the early weeds and staking the peas, their movements mirroring the exact cadence Mary had taught them decades ago. She felt a pang of pride, sharp and sweet. The garden was no longer hers to command, but the dirt beneath her daughter's fingernails was her own legacy. They were reclaiming the earth she had tended, ensuring that when the first frost came, the family would still be fed. In the corner of the room, Elizabeth moved softly, her hand resting instinctively over the swell of her belly. This second child was kicking, a restless, vibrant reminder that while one flame flickered low, another was being stoked. Elizabeth looked at her mother, a silent understanding passing between them. The strength of the Teft women wasn't lost. It was simply being redistributed. Outside, the heavy thud of a wood axe echoed from the woodlet. Samuel was prepping for the evening, but his shadow was joined by two smaller ones. Peter, the Narragansett boy who had become as much a part of the land as the stones in the walls, moved with a quiet efficiency. He guided little John, Mary's other grandson, showing him how to gather the kindling. Joshua's patience was a bridge between worlds. He helped Samuel with the heavy burdens of the war and the farm, but he always kept a watchful eye on the boy, teaching him how to read the sky and the soil, even if they were only brief moments. To Mary, seeing them together was a vision of peace, a future where the land was tended by hands that loved it, regardless of where they came from. Mary's fingers tightened around the object in her lap. It was a single oyster shell, its inner surface worn as smooth as silk by years of her thumb tracing its arc. She remembered the day John had given it to her. They were young, his boots sinking into the wet sand of the shore. He had plucked it from the shallows, rinsed it in the cold Atlantic, and pressed it into her hand. "As long as the sea returns to the shore," he had whispered, "I will return to you." John was gone now, but the shell remained, cool, solid, and enduring. It held the salt of her tears and the grit of her life. As the stars began to pierce the Rhode Island sky, Mary closed her eyes. She listened to the laughter of the boys outside, the rustle of her daughters in the soil, and the steady heartbeat of the child Elizabeth carried. She held the oyster shell to her chest, a small piece of the sea anchored to a heart that was finally ready to drift out with the tide. With a shaking hand, hardly able to read the passage, Mary wrote in her journal for the last time.
The firelight dances on the timber beams, while Mary drifts through salt-washed dreams. The garden she tended is now in their hands. As the Teft name takes root in the Rhode Island sands, she feels the new life in the stir of the room, where Elizabeth carries a flower in bloom. The cycle continues, the old and the new, like the morning that follows the evening dew. Beside her stands Samuel, steady and kind, with the farm and the future and family entwined. He watches the boys as they learn how to stand, A bridge between cultures, a gift to the land. In her palm lies the oyster, a secret of white, a gift from her John in the soft coastal light. Keep this home, she whispers, her voice like a sigh. Let no stranger's shadow pass these walls by. Take care of each other, be sturdy and true. The love in this house is the best part of you. Tell them our story when I'm gone to the shore, and keep the latch ready at the family door. She sees them all waiting, the Lord and her groom, to lead her away from the small, quiet room. The shell hits the quilt as she lets out a breath. For a life loved this deeply has no fear of death.